I'm Casey Cravens, and I'm a member of the Otago Anglers Association and the Professional Fishing Guides Association. I'm here because I love our rivers. But I've been concerned about the trend of declining water quality in mayfly and trout habitat, particularly in our lowland streams. Anglers with a lot of seasons under their belt worry that the mayfly hatches on waters like the Waipahi and the Matara simply aren't what they used to be. But something's wrong, and we hate to admit it, but we must. You can only ignore reality for so long. I'd like to thank everybody for coming out tonight. Finding the time to balance work and family is hard, and the fact that you're here means that you think this is important, and I appreciate that.
Kia ora, everybody. Thank you for coming out on a beautiful Dunedin day and a cold evening. Not only do I feel like a wallaby, I think I feel like Pat McCabe, actually, who broke his neck again on Saturday and is now retired. I'm sure I can muddle my way through, but I do want to acknowledge the work that Eugenie Sage does for the Green Party, and also David as a previous minister in the former Labour government in respect of some of the issues that we're going to talk about tonight. They are really important issues, and as we head into the election campaign, it's going to be a discussion that we have quite a bit. And I heard David's revenue spokesman the other day talk about the environment and the economy, and he described the economy as a wholly owned subsidiary of the environment. Now, that's an interesting metaphor, and I'm not sure it's one that I would necessarily use, but there is absolutely no doubt that there is a complex and important symbiosis between we as custodians of land and sea and air and those three things. And I think there is a risk when we talk about environmental issues like, in this case, clean water, that we look at the past through somewhat rose-tinted glasses. And in the post-industrial age, we have our towns and cities where they are largely because of the water bodies, whether that is oceans or rivers, very close to or running through them. As Geoff said, we don't have one. We have a beautiful harbour and the Pacific Ocean on our doorstep. And the reasons for that are twofold mainly. One is for transport, because for 200 years we largely used water for transport, people and goods. But we also use them as great big toilets. And for far too long we have been disposing lots of stuff into our rivers and waterways. I well recall when I was a child seeing some of the rivers that I fished have sewage outlets pouring straight into them. Point source discharge from industrial waste, freezing works, a number of other effluents straight into the rivers. And I think it's taken us a long, long time, a couple of generations perhaps, to turn that ship around. And by and large, we've achieved that, with some exceptions. But the non-point source discharge issue is a much more vexed one, and it will also take some time to fix. And when we take that environment economic argument, I think we need to see it in its longest or longer term context. But look, I'm very pleased with the progress that the National-led government has made in the last 5 or 6 years in respect of water quality. We came to office with a pretty big discussion already going on about how we can manage our waterways better. And the Honourable Nick Smith, as many of you know and some of you participated in, was part of the corralling of nearly 60 separate organisations, stakeholders in the water space, that came together in the Land and Water Forum and created the framework that we now have for fresh water and freshwater management. And for the very first time in this country's history, we have a set of national bottom lines for water quality. Now, you may argue that it goes too far, or not far enough, or not fast enough. And I think that's a conversation we need to continue to have. But it is for the first time, the 425,000 kilometres of rivers and streams in this country are subject to national bottom lines for water quality. Now, Some have said that it's unacceptable for any of our rivers not to be able to be swum in. But I want to take you back to that historical context, because actually many of them have never been and are unlikely to be. Sorry, that was the Prime Minister. It's really hard to hang up on the Prime Minister. The important thing to remember, though, is that we have a pathway to improving those waterways over 5 years. And what's really interesting, because the argument around farming, I think, is going to be a really important one. And the important thing to remember is that water quality now is our bottom line. So if it's not acceptable in some of those waterways, then there is a 5-year time frame once the community has decided which of its waterways which of those waterways are to be cleaned up. If they are already at that standard cannot be dropped. So those people who are worried about the intensification of our primary sector need to remember that that will be built on the back of the requirement for the water quality that we already have not to go backwards. Where water quality isn't up to standard, we are going to have the pathway to improvement. And I think that's going to be the sensible, the pragmatic and the balanced way to go. Because when we want to talk about the things that will improve child poverty, health outcomes, better education, all of those things come from a strong economy. And when we have a strong economy, that balances those things with our environmental responsibilities and record. I think we can be confident that we will get that balance right. It's not a question of either or, it is symbiotic, and I think we've got that balance pretty well underway. Apologies for the distraction. Thanks very much.
Great.
Kia ora koutou katoa. Very pleased to be here and thank the Otago Anglers for organising this. I was actually a councillor on Environment Canterbury Regional Council, and the councillors have been replaced with appointed commissioners. And acknowledge my parliamentary colleagues, David Parker, Michael Woodhouse, Claire Curran, Geoff, and thank you all for coming. I thank all of you who've stood up for our rivers and everybody who identifies with, cherishes and actually advocates for watery places like rivers, lakes, wetlands, estuaries and our aquifers. When National is clamping down on the Department of Conservation and its advocacy for fresh water, the work that you do in standing up for rivers and lakes is really important, and particularly that of Fish and Game and Forest and Bird and Whitewater New Zealand. Earlier this year, there were thousands of votes cast in an online poll that the Green Party ran to choose New Zealanders' favourite river. And there were about 8,000 votes cast, with people choosing nearly 300 different rivers as their favourite river. And that poll showed that New Zealanders all over the country love our rivers and want them protected. And they are choosing to stand up for water quality. My favourite river is probably the Clarence River, the Waiautoa in Marlborough. It's a magnificent 4 to 5 day wilderness rafting trip through dryland landscapes with very distinctive biodiversity like the Marlborough rock daisy, between the inland and the seaward kaikoras. There's quite fascinating geology there. It's a very spectacular, wild and scenic river. It's one of the few multi-day rafting trips in the wild in New Zealand, and yet there is no legal protection on it. That's why one of the Green Party's key water policies is to establish a network of protected rivers, our outstanding wild and scenic rivers, through strengthening the water conservation order provisions in the Resource Management Act so that these rivers get permanent protection. And you don't have, as we've seen under National, the Rakaia Water Conservation Order, which went all the way to the Court of Appeal, being undermined by Trustpower's application to amend it to promote more irrigation. And it was able to do that because of the ECAN Act, where National weakened the provisions around water conservation orders in Canterbury. Because we've got a network of permanently protected areas like national parks and reserves, but we don't have a network of permanently protected rivers, and we think there should be such a network. So we're going to amend the Resource Management Act to do that. Because we want rivers right across New Zealand, from their source to their sea, to be clean and healthy for fishing, for swimming, for gathering kai from, but mostly also for their intrinsic values and to support a wide variety of fish and other wildlife. And National, in terms of Michael's comments, doesn't see that as the aspiration that all New Zealanders have. We think that people share our view that rivers should be fit for fishing, for swimming and gathering kai from, and not just for wading and boating, because that's a fatal flaw in the national bottom lines that National has come out with. There, the levels of faecal coliform that are set as the national bottom line are suitable for wading and boating, but they're too high to be able to go swimming safely without the risk of getting sick. So we would overhaul and strengthen the current national policy statement. National gutted the version that the Shepherd Board of Inquiry delivered after a robust public consultation process. We would go back to that. We'd get rid of some of the objectives like maintain and enhance overall water quality in a region, which allows some rivers to be improved but others to be degraded, because you're looking at the whole region. And we'd have a strong national environmental standard for water quality that would ensure that our rivers and lakes are clean enough for swimming and for gathering kai from. We'd set maximum limits for contaminants such as nitrogen and phosphorus, cadmium, sediment. There's no sediment standard in the current NPS, for example, so that we get much stronger regulatory framework, because you've got some councils around New Zealand that don't want to move the standards up. Ones like Taranaki, for example, which wanted it to be optional even to have a secondary contact recreation standard. So to make sure that there are consistent bottom lines across the country, we would overhaul the NPS and put in place a strong national standard for water quality. We'd do the same for water flows. There's been a draft national environmental standard for water quantity, which MFE was working on, called for submissions on, and then stopped work on. So we see that also as important in providing our national bottom lines. We'd phase out the massive subsidies that are going to irrigation, 120 million to the Crown Irrigation Company, with the promise of another 400 million from the proceeds of the sale of our energy companies, because we think those schemes should be funded by the private sector, not subsidised by government for more intensive agriculture and more water pollution. So we'd wind up the Crown Irrigation Company. We'd put a charge on the commercial use of water for irrigation, and the revenue that that generates would be recycled back into sustainable water management, assisting with fencing of streams and rivers, and with riparian planting to act as a buffer for nutrients and sediment. And we would invest much more in protecting our Indigenous species. Under DOC, under this government, the number of submissions that the department has done on resource plans and on resource consents has gone down by 2/3. We would invest funding in the Department of Conservation so it can advocate for fresh water beyond the conservation estate, and so that it can do much more about protecting our Indigenous species. Nearly 75% of our native freshwater fish are threatened with extinction. These fish often are found nowhere else on the planet. We have an international responsibility to protect their habitat, but National's pollution economy and the reliance on the expansion of dairying onto more and more marginal lands is leading to a lot more pollution, which is degrading their habitat and our rivers. So we love our rivers. There is a major choice that you can make this election in casting your party vote to the Green Party to develop strong policies to protect our rivers, lakes, wetlands and aquifers. Thank you.
Greetings to everyone who's come out tonight, including to my colleagues. Can I declare an interest? I used to be counsel for the Otago Acclimatisation Society and then the Fish and Game Council, and was lucky enough to be trained by a guy who died earlier this year, Jim Guthrie, who was the leader in water conservation orders throughout New Zealand. And I personally did the local conservation order on the Pamahaka. I was counsel in the Mataura case. This is after I'd spent my rings and departed Jim sort of from under his guard. Mataura and its tributaries from source to sea, the Kawara River, the Wakatipu, the tributaries to Lake Wakatipu, and the Ahuriri River, as well as some various wetlands in other parts of the country. We actually have a lot of conservation orders down in this part of the world because of the Fish and Game Council, essentially. I've got a long time interest in water quality and also the intersection of energy and water because of the price that we pay locally with hydroelectricity in this part of the world. I was Minister of Climate Change and Energy and had a lot to do with the Renewable Energy NPS, which made sure that we took into account the long-term effects on rivers, effectively, of damming, which is entrenched in that national policy statement. I really believe that's the right thing to do. And indeed, recently in the last year, I was an expert witness in respect of energy policy on the extension of the national policies of the conservation order on the Nevis River. I've long held the view that the most important river to anyone is their local river. And I think that if your local river is clean, then all of our rivers will be clean. Actually, I see Donald Scott there, one of our witnesses on the Mataura Conservation Order. I haven't seen you for a while, Donald. It's nice to see you. If all our local rivers are clean, then all of our rivers will be clean. It's pretty simple. I grew up swimming in rivers. The Otago, the Tairi River, the Upper Tairi, particularly around Coconut, is where I spent a lot of my youth. The Waikawaiti River, I've got a place at Karitani. I'm really interested in estuaries too, and I'll come back to that. The Manahira Kia. Earlier this year, I was up in the headwaters of the Rangitata. Couldn't resist it. Chucked off my clothes and jumped into a clean river and had a swim. I really believe in clean rivers. And I do not think that that we have to put up with rivers that aren't clean enough to swim in. And I think it's a very, very simple proposition. Now, what do you do to get there? Well, I'm one of the people who was critical of the Land and Water Forum because it was always a setup. It was a pretend collaborative process where, in the end, they got to a decent outcome, not as good as the original Shepherd National Policy Statement. They got to it, and then the government allowed a couple of the parties to it to run round the back and rat on the outcome and get a worse outcome, which doesn't work. Because, as Eugenie has said, you cannot have a national policy statement that has standards under it that allow pollution to get worse in our rivers to a standard which is wadeable rather than swimmable. And that's effectively we've got. So what do we need to do? We need to go back to the Shepherd version of the national policy statement. Essentially, he said, or the panel said, clean rivers ought not to be allowed to get dirtier, and dirty rivers ought to be cleaned up over a generation. In order to prevent clean waters from getting dirtier, you have to say that the cause of rivers getting dirtier has to be controlled in some way. We know that what causes rivers to get dirtier is increases in land use intensity, because that means you've got more livestock effluent and more nutrient per hectare flowing into the rivers. And therefore, he said that sort of thing could not be permitted, it had to be a controlled activity. Further, he said, even when you do it well, you will still have a cumulative impact upon the waterway unless you are having some other form of abatement somewhere else on the property or within the catchment so that the overall load on the river is no higher. And those are the simple principles. Clean rivers ought to be kept clean, dirty rivers ought to be cleaned up over a generation, and you've got to control increases in intensity of land use. And that's what we stand for. And we say the standard to which you should be aiming to clean up those dirtier rivers is swimmability, not wadeability. The wadeability standard says that there will be an up to 5% chance of becoming ill from your wading experience, because you will touch water and you might get it in your mouth, and the E. coli could make you crook. It's not a high enough standard. The public of New Zealand are with us on that. Can I say something about estuaries? We've also said we will promote a national policy statement on estuaries. The biggest problem there is siltation and, again, nitrogen. Estuaries are already rich in phosphorus. When you add nitrogen, you get algal blooms. Two final things about the RMA. When New Zealand's environmental standards are such that under current environmental rules, you cannot let your dog run along the side of some riverbanks because they might ingest algae that cause them to die. It's not the time to undermine the environmental baselines in the RMA. They are not the problem. One final point. I think the National Party and the ACT Party and some of their other partners, they make a mistake about the extent of private property rights. There is no private property right to pollute a river. There is no existing use right under the RMA. There is no existing use right under the RMA to pollute a river. Absent a resource consent or a rule and a plan that allows it, it's illegal. Which brings you back to, if you haven't got a decent NPS, what do? Well, you're actually relying upon regional councils, and actually our regional council has come out with a very good plan. And the nitrogen limits, and I think they should be congratulated, and I greet the councillors who are here. The nitrogen limits that are proposed for the Otago plan are good. I have some concerns that between now and 2020 you can have increases in intensity of land use that actually make it worse before you get to the limit being applied. I could be disabused of that if I've got that wrong, but that's my reading of it until now. That's probably enough points for me in the meantime. The wild and scenic rivers thing, there's always been this tension in New Zealand between protecting your local river and just protecting the big ones that rise in national parks and are wild and scenic rivers and are clean anyway because there's so much water in them it gets flushed out to sea, but they're so swift you can't swim in them. That's not my view of New Zealand. Wild and scenic rivers are all well and good, but I want my local river to be clean.
Thank you. Gosh, if the scientists can't agree on what a good definition of water quality is, it's going to be very, very hard for politicians. And indeed, that's a very uncomfortable place for politicians to be in, between groups of scientists that don't agree. But I think the NPS does define, in a technical sense, the sorts of measures that define water quality, because that's effectively what we're talking about, stuff that goes into it that shouldn't be there or should be there in less quantity. And I can't say any more than I would be guided by those.
Well, I think you look at what the World Health Organization criteria are. They include turbidity, which is important, the clarity of your water. Nutrient levels, because of course those nutrients cause the overgrowth of things that you don't want too much of. The two most important in New Zealand are probably phosphorus and nitrogen. And then in respect of bacterial levels, E. coli is the one that's the most measured. I'm sure there are other nasties in there that could be measured as well, like Giardia. But E. coli is generally the one that's the proxy for a lot of other things. And then what do you monitor in order to look at those things other than just the general levels? Well, you actually look at the effect on one, whether it's meeting World Health Organization criteria for clean enough to swim in, whether you've got health of your macro invertebrate communities, and through then actually the fish put up with a lot more than people and macro invertebrates will. So, but it's also the effect on fish.
I think it's got elements in terms of the ecological health and the issues like sediment as well in terms of the clarity. So there are a number of measures that can be used, and I guess that what the question also highlights is the role of science in policy making. There was a whole group of scientists that were involved in developing the national policy statement, but I went to a seminar in Waikato and there was a lot of, nobody was admitting to being the author of the attributes which ended up in the NPS, because they seem to have been quite significantly changed by some of the ministry officials, and there are some quite major and important indicators of water quality, like the macroinvertebrate community index, which is a recognised measure of the biological health of our rivers, which has not been included in the national policy statement, nor is there any indicator for sediment. So you've got scientists recommending that they be included, and yet that advice hasn't been carried through into the policy document, and it should be. So politicians should look at the objective recommendations of the scientists and ensure that it's in technical documents like the NPS, and there's a major gap when those recommendations haven't gone through.
I guess to summarise the disagreement between scientists, just for the the public. I think the key thing is that the ecologists, of course, want to see a healthy river where stuff can live, and whereas the wider, more industry affiliated, more industry affiliated scientists are much more interested in. They think the definition of water quality depends on what the community says it is. So if the local community is a bunch of farmers and wants to use it as a drain, then that's what they should be allowed to do. That's kind of where there's that discussion coming from. The issue with this, what it leads to is really whether the standards that we have, because the standards that National put forward allow communities to set what they want to do in local areas. The question really, I think, is whether that accounts for future generations and sufficiently accounts for future generations. Yeah, it's a question for you guys, yeah. Whether you think that the standards account for future generations.
No, I don't think they do, and it's partly because of this objective in the National Policy Statement to maintain and enhance the overall water quality in a region, which allows more rivers to become polluted, and because the bottom lines that have been set allow considerable headroom for the expansion of intensive agriculture like dairying. And you've had the major report by the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment, which show that that's going to result in considerably greater water pollution, particularly in Canterbury, Otago and Southland, because it's expanding onto more and more marginal land. So the short answer is no.
Yeah, I've got nothing to add.
Yes, over time, and I want to take issue with a comment that David made in his introductory remarks about the fact that water quality standards should be to maintain the levels of quality in those acceptable rivers and improve the ones where they are below the acceptable margin, and that's exactly what the NPS does as far as I'm aware. But I also want to say that this government is spending about 5 times more than Labor did in its first 4 years in office compared with Labor's last 4 years in office on cleaning up our rivers. And there's also a substantial sum for specific projects to detoxify and decontaminate a number of our waterways and water bodies that have become very toxic over a long period of time. So while the answer is yes, there's no immediate fix, and it will take some time.
Well, I mean, it's absolutely abundantly clear that the current rules allow increasing degradation of waterways. There's no doubt about that. I'm sorry, Michael.
Again, there are a number of smaller tributaries and streams and runoff streams where they really haven't been swimmable for a long time and may never be, or arguably shouldn't need to be, if we have our, the point that David made, the stream that I want to swim in and fish in and wade in is clean, and everybody has that outcome. Then of the 425,000 kilometres of waterways, we will have a much, much greater level of clean rivers, and I think that's a really good start.
Okay, my question for David now is, you guys have put an aim for getting swimmable rivers within a generation. Why are you taking so long?
Because it can't be done quicker without shooting the cows.
Over to you, Eugenie.
And we're not proposing that. It in part goes to how quickly this can be done. I mean, there is some work that is, there is good work being done by the best farmers, some very good work. They're increasingly monitoring their nutrient application. They're increasingly being careful where their livestock are in terms of flow of effluent to waterways, including through rain events. And it takes time to do that better. So I'm not going to say you haven't been allowed to do what you've been allowed to do till today. We're actually going to turn you off tomorrow. But I do think we should stop it getting worse tomorrow, which you need to do by controlling increases in intensity of land use. Can I address that cost point, or is that a?
No, we're going to come back to that. Trust me.
Okay, okay. I think that essentially answers it. I mean, in respect of estuaries, it's a little bit different because, you know, it's phosphorus plus nitrogen plus sediment ruins your estuaries. And I personally know estuaries. In fact, I'm going to quote the Honourable Judith Collins, who was quoted earlier this year when questioned about Auroveda's actions in respect of wetland destruction as they dragged out ancient kauri. Said, "I don't care about wetlands; they're swamps. Go and talk to someone who does care." And it was a gift from God for me, because I was about to give a speech, an environmental speech, which I've got copies of here for your interest in it. Because I put up my hand and said, I am interested in wetlands. I want to protect them. And they are our rarest ecosystems in the country. They're easily reclaimed at the edges. And, they have the edges nipped away through tidal gates put on them and just through sort of incipient reclamation and because of activity at the edges. And we need to take better care of them. And we've got some wonderful estuaries around here. And, it's hard to find a flounder in some of them. They are declining in quality, and I know that from one that I spent a lot of time close to. Now, it's not all bad news. They're actually, again, sometimes you actually see evidence of progress, but we haven't got our estuarine decline under control in New Zealand yet either, and that's something else I feel strongly about. That's why we're going to have an NPS on that too.
Great. Eugenie, are you going to shoot all the cows?
No, but we have reached the limit of cows in a lot of catchments in New Zealand. And Dr. Susan Walker at Lanke Research in Christchurch has just shown, in Otago, has just shown in her study that there are major biodiversity impacts from the expansion of dairying, as well as water pollution ones, because there's been the loss of about 4,200 hectares annually of between 2002 and 2008 of shrublands, riparian areas, wetlands, as dairying expands onto more and more marginal lands. And it's doing that in Canterbury onto more and more stony soils, leaky soils, the nitrogen leaches much more readily. So with a stronger national policy statement, it needs to prohibit the expansion of dairying in sensitive catchments and tightly control it in other areas, because we've got the equivalent of 84 million cows in New Zealand, out of 84 million people in New Zealand with our 6 million cows. And that is the upper limit, so it needs to be progressively reduced, particularly in sensitive catchments, but you can't do that overnight. And we'd add more value to the milk we produce rather than just growing milk supply as National's doing.
So you're going to make cheese. Do you know how to make cheese, Eugenie?
I know how it's made, but I haven't ever made it. More nutraceuticals, more infant formula, just much more than milk powder.
Well, I'm very happy to stand up as a politician and say that I'm happy to have a bottom line, and I think it should be implemented in the way in which the RMA contemplated when it was passed, that it would be appropriate environmental lines would be imposed by way of national policy statements. I also note that it's an incredible waste of time and money and energy to have separate battles over what I think is a pretty simple idea that our rivers should be clean enough to swim in. That should be imposed as a minimum through the RMA. I think that, and I think there's be a fair number of regional councils would admit this, that they were taken a bit by surprise as to the rate of change occasioned by intensification of land use in about a decade, when dairy prices went through the roof and therefore incentivised a lot more dairy conversion. Having said that, I also think that it's a little bit, we can't let them off the hook completely, because regional councils have had the ability under the RMA since it was passed to actually stop this problem getting as bad as it has been, and there has to be some responsibility taken by regional councils for it having got to the point that central government needed to intervene through a national policy statement. But there have been mistakes on the government side as well. One of the reasons why there was delay in government was actually the foreshore and seabed debacle, because post foreshore and seabed there was a considerable distrust amongst Maoridom of any moves that central government made in respect of water quality and water allocation. And at the time, water allocation and water quality were being dealt with in the same process, and it took a couple of years to separate water quality from water allocation and not provoke a reaction from people who were nervous as a consequence of foreshore and seabed.
In a previous life when I was working with Forest and Bird, we went through environment court case after environment court case trying to develop rules in district plans and regional plans. You'd fight exactly the same battles over and over again. So that's the advantage of having a national policy statement and national bottom lines, to avoid all of that litigation at the local level. So lower compliance costs, agree with David. And it's wasted energy. The plan process becomes incredibly expensive when you get this repeated litigation. And the RMA was always envisaged as having a lot more national guidance through national policy statements, and successive governments didn't implement those.
Just while you're there, Eugenie, because I have another question for Michael. I mean, I just want to draw you a little bit further on that in terms of how you think this is going to pan out. You're from Christchurch. You're seeing these communities, these community processes on the ground, incredibly intensive processes with, farmers, local community people concerned about their river coming together. I mean, what chance do you think communities have to stand up to a big industry like dairy to be able to argue for water quality?
Well, I guess that was one of the deficiencies in the Land and Water Forum, that Dairy New Zealand and others had very deep pockets, so could resource their participants much more. And in Canterbury, where you've got a collaborative process with the 10 different zones, there is an advantage in that people begin to understand each other's points of view. But the basic bottom lines, I think, should still be set with a lot more science advice, and then people debate how you actually implement those, rather than having all of the debate on what those bottom lines should be, because that always ends up as getting to the lowest common denominator often. So the community processes are good at getting a shared understanding, but they don't always deliver, because you often get quite a mediocre result.
Can I just add to that? Most people don't have the capacity nor the deep interest to pursue all these things through court. So you're actually reliant on NGOs like Fish and Game. And you need to be aware that Fish and Game, under this government, they had one of their fee increases refused by now retiring Minister Kate Wilkinson. And they were told that they weren't getting their fee increase because the government was dissatisfied with their environmental advocacy. I know that to be true because I've spoken to the head of Fish and Game in Wellington, who told me that. And then recently we had the threats made by Nick Smith, the current Minister of Conservation, saying we'll look at changing your act so that you can't advocate for the environment. Fish and Game has done fishing. I think there's a pattern of conduct here personally, and I believe Fish and Game Fish and Game have done more for environmental protection of waterways than any other NGO in New Zealand.
Yeah. Let's hear from Michael. Pass the microphone to Michael. Have you got any response, Michael?
Oh, well, look, there's been a broad brush through the question of will Eugenie shoot cows, and so.
No, we're really talking about the community processes.
Well, yeah, but I think they're not actually that disconnected. The question of whether or not you can have an absolutely consistent MPS and standard in Waikato as you have in Hawke's Bay, as you have in Nelson, as you have in Southland, because the land use, the geology, the climate, the intensification, the amount of forest, there are so many other variables that make a one-size-fits-all statement perhaps unworkable. And it's very important to me and to the government to make sure that the community does have a strong input into what those bottom lines are for their region. Now, we can argue about who has more influence, but I think the process is a robust one, and it's necessary given those differences.
Great. So keep the microphone, Michael, because I just want to follow you up on that. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about the actual values of the bottom lines in the NOF, and I don't know, given this isn't your area of expertise, I don't know if you want to comment on anything like that, but nitrogen having a bottom line of 6.9 milligrams per litre versus 0.44 here in Otago, which has been set by the local council. Interested in your thoughts on what the difference is there, why there's the difference, and and the much asked question of why are things like sediment and macroinvertebrate community index, which basically means bugs, right? Bugs living in the river. There's a measure of the bugs living in the river. Why that's not considered one of the bottom line measures. I don't know if you have comments.
Yeah, no, well, that's going way above my knowledge. But I would say, and you do, David compliments the Otago Regional Council's plan, which actually took 4 years, I think, to be agreed and started before the NPS did, and in fact before the Land and Water Forum, about the same time as when it started. So it was a long journey, but I had foresters, for example, coming in just talking about sediment, to say that even if they adopted world's best practice in forestry management, it would not be possible for them to have been able to comply with some of the sediment runoff standards that were initially in 6A when, during a storm or flood. And I think that that's an example of where we've got to be really careful about what we're talking about when we're setting levels at points in time, because as you know, they will change according to a number of climatic issues, not the least of which is season and flood situations. So it seems to me that the challenge is actually to find what those best practice standards are and expect them of all of the stakeholders in the water space, whether that's forestry or farming or horticulture or viticulture.
No one's suggesting that that should be the standard for a river and flood.
That was the initial draft
Well,
standard, and good negotiation saw a way through that.
I just wondered, I thought this would be quite a nice time. I don't know if you're keen to do this.
I'm happy to answer that.
Yeah. It'd just be a good time to bring in. We have someone here from the Otago Regional Council who might be willing to comment on why your guys' standards are so much higher than the rest of the country.
I'm Matt Hickey. I manage the science team at the Otago Regional Council. Had quite a big input into those standards. The sediment standard you discussed there hasn't changed at all through the 6A process. It has 2 rules under the sediment rule. You basically can't cut down a forest without any mitigation strategies in place to prevent your sediment entering a waterway. So that's a prohibited activity. That's as tough as you can get. And the other standard is you can't have more than a 40% change in clarity at any flow, whether it's a flood flow or a low flow, to stop sediment getting into waterways and into estuaries. The point being that as a river increases in flow, naturally it gets dirtier anyway. So the 40% change is relative at all flows.
So just while you got the microphone, Matt, any comments on why the bottom line in Otago was 0.44 milligrams per litre, and whereas the bottom line is 6.9 milligrams per litre in the national standards?
Our standards for nitrogen and phosphorus, we've got both of those in, are to control periphyton growth in streams. So 0.44 is our most lenient standard. In other catchments, it's 0.075 for nitrate.
So that's like up
in the lakes or in Central Otago, North Otago. Yep. So 0.44, slightly higher to reflect in some catchments get more flushing flows, so they can tolerate a bit more nutrient.
And why is that? What's the difference with Otago? What's your aim?
We're aiming for ecological health, swimmability, and able to gather food safely from a waterway.
So you have swimmability is your bottom line right across the region.
Swimmability is our most lenient bottom line.
That means you've got to walk on water in other places. That's great. Thanks, Matt. Thanks for that little input. Now I want to move on to cost, David. And since you've been so eager to talk about this,
well, I wanted to respond to the comments about we spend the most, and in the end, I'll come back to why I don't think that's all that important an issue in the end. It is true that the last government, faced with problems in respect of typo taupo nutrient loading that was going to be a problem over about 100 years actually, and more pressing problems in respect of Rotorua, that we actually, with the support of Jeanette Fitzsimons at the time, had approved in our budget out-year funding for some very expensive works that needed to be done, and the council put up with a bit of money and central government put a bit of money up, and you guys have continued with that spending, and most of it has fallen under your watch because it had only just started under ours. But I personally opposed that. I lost in Cabinet. I'll tell you why I opposed it. Because I don't think the public should pay to clean up pollution. The country cannot afford to put on the taxpayer's balance sheet the cost of cleaning up people's pollution, because they haven't got a right to do it, and what you need is decent regulatory rules. So I would have just regulated that. I lost. And the cabinet, and I accept the cabinet decision. It was a wise one. It says you actually have to carry people with you sometimes, but we can't afford to do that as a nation everywhere. We can't afford to say that the only way that we can clean up our waterways is to pay people to change land use, or to pay people to do this or that, when it's actually their obligation not to pollute. We should just enforce the law.
So now, it's now 2014, not 2000, whatever it was. Yeah. What's your policy now on cleaning up? How are you going to pay for it?
I'll enforce regulated bottom lines primarily. That's how to clean it up, because otherwise it'll never happen, because there'll never be enough money to do it if you try and take it on the public balance sheet. In respect of another issue, for me this is not primarily a pollution issue. One of my core values is that you ought not to privatise. You ought not to compensate what are true private rights without proper compensation. But neither ought you to privatise public rights. And at the moment, our public rivers are used for enormous economic value in both electricity and in respect of irrigation. And you see it in the difference between irrigated land compared with non-irrigated land, excluding the cost of the irrigation infrastructure. And so we've said that we will introduce a resource rental on water, which will be a market-based one, and it'll vary catchment to catchment. And in respect of the revenue that comes from a resource rental on water, we've said that we will apply that to local. We'll pay the money back to the local community. We haven't actually worked out how we'll distribute it, whether it'll be through regional councils or whether there'll be some other mechanism. But that money will go back into a combination of ecological work. Maybe it'll, if you're the Omakau area and you're having to upgrade your water supply because the river's too dirty to take water from because of the agricultural pressure, maybe the money should go back to the community to upgrade some of their drinking water. And we've also said that we're open to some of that water, actually, some of that money that will be coming from the farming sector going to improved irrigation infrastructure, including storage, because there is a case for cropping water and using it in drought time, so long as you've got the environmental baselines right, so that you're not ruining your rivers. So we're happy for some of that money to go to that as well, because we don't think it's right that the current irrigation infrastructure funds are effectively taken from taxing people, including people being paid the minimum wage, in order to subsidise irrigation and increase land values.
So can I just check, who are you charging for this water?
The irrigators.
Not power companies?
Oh, well, no, they've got it even tougher. We're stripping out the value that they're taking from hydro. At the moment, 60% of the electricity in New Zealand comes from hydro. It's the cheapest electricity to produce in the world, bar none, cheaper than anything else, whether it's nuclear or gas or geothermal or wind. And the price at which they are paid is not set according to how much it costs to produce or what's a fair value on their dam assets. It's actually the price that's given to the most expensive electricity that is dispatched, because that's how the electricity market currently works to price electricity. And we've said we're going to change the pricing model so that those that produce hydroelectricity effectively can't profit off the public rivers, and they just get their operating costs plus a fair return on their capital. And then you have to have some intermediate body averaging the price of different different cost sources of electricity, so that the consumer sees one price. So that's how.
So you're not going to charge hydro companies for using the water.
Yeah.
You're just going to take away.
Yeah, and that is a less economically efficient way of doing it than pricing water. And the reason we chose the less economically efficient one was our experience in emissions pricing, and I was climate change minister, was that our pricing carbon emissions was misrepresented by the electricity sector, the private participants there, and our political opponents said it was going to drive up the price of power disproportionately. It did have a small effect on power, but they overstated and used it as an increase for power prices. And we knew that if we said that we're going to charge hydro generators for the use of their water rather than just pay them a lower price, that they would say that's going to drive up the price of electricity, and therefore everyone would have hated the policy. This way, people can clearly see that their electricity prices are going to go down, and they like it as a policy.
Okay, cool. Michael, do you want? Let's get Michael in here now. Did you want to respond to that?
Oh, I just wanted to clarify with David whether what I think he just said was that and I'm not trying to catch you out here. I just want to clarify your policy. The argument you lost in cabinet and when in government, you've now won in the preparation of your policy going into this election in terms of the funding, the clean-up of rivers with a resource rental on the users of the water as they use it. Yeah. For example, irrigators and hydro schemes and so on. Is that because I haven't caught up with that?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we've said in respect of hydro, we're stripping out the super profit that's taken from the public water, which is the fuel that's used to make the electricity, and we're going to give that back to consumers and businesses, and they'll get a few $100 a year off their power price, and commercial tariffs will drop by about 5%. Increasing jobs, actually, we had that modelled. But in respect of rural uses of water, large rural irrigation uses, not the per capita use that the farmer or their families or rural communities or indeed cities have in respect of domestic use, which is actually quite small relatively. We've said that for large rural takes that they will be priced according to a market mechanism that's yet to be properly designed, and that money will be, amongst other things, used for waterway restoration where necessary. The Rotorua Lakes might have been a case in point, although that's now underway. And will also allow some of it to be used for irrigation infrastructure, including water storage.
Just a supplementary question. So what will you do in terms of resource rental on the new water storage initiatives that are being established by a joint funding part by the government and part by the private sector, both of which requires a rate of return already? It's not, the government is not giving this away. They are going to get a return on their investment with the private sector, and that will be new storage. Will they be excluded from the resource rental framework?
Well, actually, there is a subsidy there at the moment. That's money that's been voted by Parliament. Well, it shows up in the budget as money that's being spent. But it's still a proper question. What happens in respect of a new irrigation scheme? Now, we've said we'll transition out of the... A new water storage scheme. Okay, a new water storage scheme. We've said we'll transition out of what you're doing to fund it out of resource rentals. There'll be a transition involved because you can't just click your fingers and go from one to the other. And then in respect of what would be the price, let's take Ruataniwha, because I've been quoted on this already. Ruataniwha is a big irrigation proposal on the Tukituki River, which may or may not go ahead. If it goes ahead, the estimated cost for the water that's going to be charged to the farmers for the irrigation infrastructure before it gets to their farm, this is plus their on-farm costs, is 23 cents per cubic metre of water. I think that's the amount. It's 20-something anyway. I think it's 23. Now, the economics of that will be marginal, and the price on water for the first 30 years of their right has to be certain, otherwise you won't get the investment, and it may well be that for the first 30 years of that scheme, the price of water is close to nil. But there are lots of schemes around New Zealand where the cost of the equivalent for similar increases in output or similar productivity might be 5 cents per cubic metre. And you can see that somewhere in the middle between the difference between 5 and 23, which is 18 cents, somewhere in there is a fair division of value as between farmer and the public. So that's yet to be worked out, but you can see that there will be some new schemes that are marginally economic, and a market price for water there will be close to zero for the first 30 years. And we recognise people have to have certainty of contract or they can't commit to the investment, which is a good, and the investment's a good thing for the country, subject to environmental bottom lines. But in other places, the price will be significant.
Yeah, because it is a significant capital outlay. And indeed, for many of those projects, there is also a public as well as a private benefit, if only simply to regenerate and maintain our existing waterways. So I think the government, it's appropriate for the government to have some contribution, but as I said, that is not a one-way street. There will be a return on that. These are long-term assets too, with 30 years actually as a payback period for an asset of that nature is actually not a very long time. And indeed, if the price per cubic metre is too high, then you can quickly recalibrate the rate of return to be over a longer period of time, and as long as the asset is well maintained, it still makes good economic sense. So yes, I think there is a role for government to play in that. We've decided that we will invest in that because that will have significant knock-on effects to the nation's wealth, and it will reduce the amount of environmental impact on our existing waterways, which is what we want. It's an example of that symbiosis that can be created. This is not environment or economy. And I think those water storage projects and irrigation projects are a really good example of that. Two really good questions. Firstly, I would say that I was surprised that as many as 10% of people said no to the question that Fish and Game posed, actually. But I do think it is relevant how one frames that question. And if the question was, as Eugenie has put Green Party policy, if I've heard it correctly, that every single river and stream and tributary and estuary and lake in this country will be 100% pure and swimmable, and the cost to that is the massive de-intensification of the industries that are the backbone of our economy and our wealth, would you support that? I think you might get a quite different answer. But again, it's time-based. And for the 400, and look, you guys know these lakes and rivers better than I ever will. You're out there every week and you see the changes in the fish health, in the water health, in the whole ecosystem. So I'm not going to question whether or not it's better, worse, or the same as it was when we were all kids. But you've asked the question about tourism. And tourism actually in and of itself has a significant environmental impact. And it's going gangbusters. As Minister of Immigration, I can tell you I can see the bow wave of new tourists heading this way this summer. Our offshore offices are massively busy. I was having dinner with David Kennedy from Destination Queenstown last night, and he's now with Ngāi Tourism, and he is seeing already in the shoulder season a significant upswing in tourism activity in Queenstown on those rivers and in the upper tributaries, which is the pristine fishing destinations. They are being heavily fished and successfully fished because the fish stock at the moment, as I understand it, is very, very good. So that bow wave of tourism is certainly going to continue to increase. So again, a balance, sensible, pragmatic policies that recognise that we do have a number of industries that play an important part in our economic, cultural and social development, and tourism is one of them, but we need to be careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, if you pardon the pun.
Well, I don't think it makes sense to give funding to clean up Lake Ellesmere, Te Waihora on the one hand, and then allow the major expansion and intensification of dairying through the Central Plains scheme up gradient of that lake, just creating a whole lot more nutrient pollution. So the resource rental is a critical part of our policy, because if you are a tourist company taking guided walks on conservation land, you pay a concession fee to the Department of Conservation for the privilege of using public land for private use. Similarly, people using water for private benefit should pay a resource rental, and that revenue would be directed back into more sustainable water management and water restoration. But I think I'll stop there because I think you would like to ask some questions.
Yes. So can I just check though, your resource rental policy is quite similar, is that?
We haven't done quite the detail, but the concept, yes.
Great. All right, young man, I'll deliver the microphone to you.
Thank you.
You guys, do you guys want to stand up and just have a quick stretch while you're all thinking your questions? No, you're good? Okay, great. Fire away.
Right. Well, now, the first thing I want to say is that the major contributor to deterioration is intensive dairying, full stop. Now, would you challenge that? No. Okay. You're not challenging it. Right. What political mechanisms can you envisage that would prevent the increase in intensive dairying? Thank you.
The mechanism is a stronger regulatory framework through the national bottom line and national environmental standards, which would then, if you set the bottom lines appropriately, ensure that councils, regional councils, control land use such as intensive dairying. At the moment, many district plans require a resource consent for forestry planting, but don't do anything for a change from dryland farming to dairying. There should be a resource consent for dairying.
I think you have to exercise control at the point of intensification. I'm not saying there should be no more intensification. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that if you have it, it has to be done in a way that you can show that the overall impact on waterways is not going to be higher, and that's quite a hard thing to show sometimes. In other occasions, it won't be as hard. But that's essentially that's got to be the rule. So permitted activity for increases in intensity and land use was the thing that the Shepherd National Policy Statement effectively recommended against.
Look, it's actually a question I think that's best actually answered by the farming community. And when I say the farming community, I'm not talking about farmers alone. Increasingly, farming is a very, very scientific process. And if you're talking about intensification being more farms without any other change to farming practice, then most of us would say no. But there's been a significant change in soil science, grass science, methane emission science, nitrate use practice, riparian planting, keeping cows out of rivers and streams, and all of those things, effluent collection and redistribution on the soil, all of which creates less of a environmental footprint on farm. And we need to continue to let the science evolve and lead good farming practice so that we have greater productivity off our land and a reduced impact on our land, air and waterways. So we could have, and this, I don't want to get eggs thrown at me, but it seems to me that there is a way of being more intensive and less impact on the environment with good science.
How you doing? Yeah, look, Mike Lord, can you hear me? I had a question for Eugenie. I just, I was intrigued to hear you say that you would, for example, produce less milk powder and more infant formula and high products. I just think that's a wee bit of a, just trying to think of the right word, but a glib. It's an easy thing to say, it's a hard thing to do. Look, do you honestly think if it was that simple, Fonterra and the other companies around this country would not do that and extrapolate those things? And the other question was, in regards to your water quality, the water charges, why would you pick on one sector of the commercial community and not the others? What about, food processing plants, vegetable washers, all sorts of people, car washers, anyone that uses water, even people in town? Why should one sector of the rural community pay for water when everyone in town gets it for free? No, look, can I just say one thing? A man's just said something here that's totally incorrect, and I'll correct him. He said we pay for our water as part of your rates. Now, I'll tell you, you don't pay for water as part of your rates. You pay for water delivery. The cost of the water comes through your rates, and you pay for the infrastructure, just like as a farmer or an irrigator pays for his share of the electricity as a scheme or thing. He doesn't pay for his water at the moment, and neither do you.
A major part of the Greens' economic policy is an investment in innovation, $1 billion over 3 years in research and development to actually broaden the base of our economy. In terms of other OECD countries, New Zealand invests approximately half of what they do in research and development. So that would be more investment with R&D and things like the ICT sector, renewable energy to get a slice of the $1 trillion market in renewables, so that we're not so reliant on dairying and so vulnerable. So diversification there. And then in terms of the rental, irrigation, because they are the biggest users of water, with a lot of hydro schemes, the water goes back into and is available downstream, except for things like the Waia. And it's a community right to have drinking water and household supply, and the proportion of water allocated in New Zealand for community supply is very, very small. So irrigation is the biggest user of water.
Could I also add something to that? I think that we're proposing to treat give everyone a domestic use allowance, whether they're in rural areas or cities. So we don't see an inconsistency of treatment as between them. Your point in respect of Fonterra, I think I'm one of the people. I'm quite proud of Fonterra as a New Zealander, and I think they do a good job. And I take pride from the fact that the Labour government actually brought Fonterra into being and actually overrode local competition issues in respect to the local milk market to the detriment of local consumers because of the national interest and profitability offshore. And I think that Fonterra has a plan for itself that is very sophisticated, that sees it earning more and more money from its branded products offshore. And I also understand the economics of moving raw milk or heavier products, including cheese, not as good as in respect of locally produced milk, taking the water out of it and sending it offshore as milk powder. So I'm not here criticising Fonterra, but I don't think that means that you should be able to use for private good public resources. And I think it's fair that a resource rental is charged for the private use of valuable public goods. So I'm not being critical of Fonterra in saying that. That's just one of the principles that I believe in. Other people disagree, but some people agree.
Michael, do you want to comment?
I would just add, and the questioner may well be aware of this, and to the point, I don't think Eugenia was being glib, and the predominant product from Fonterra is milk fat for export. But it's less well known that they make several hundred, possibly around 1,500 separate value-added branded products for the international market, from cheese to yogurt to butter to milk, infant formula, hundreds of them. So we are already, Fonterra is a very good model, and David's right, I agree with him. It's an iconic company that is already adding significant amount of value to milk fat before much of it goes offshore.
Tēnā koutou katoa. My name is Daniel Stripe. I was recently on the board of Permaculture in New Zealand, so I'm interested in permaculture. My question for all three of the panellists, really, here representing their parties, is in terms of a sort of 50, 100-year perspective. We've talked a bit about the economics and balancing the economics with environmental values. We are at this point in history at the peak of global oil production, and pretty soon, once the tar sands and the fracking stop artificially inflating that production, we're going to start going down the other side of the bell curve, and there's going to be less and less energy available for unnecessary activities like exporting products from one country to another when they can be produced locally. So my question for all three panellists is, what is your 50, 100-year prognosis for the New Zealand economy when exporting becomes energetically impractical?
Oh, I disagree. Actually, if I think the world runs out of environmental resource long before it runs out of fossil fuels. And if you're going to try and win public opinion, in my opinion, in favour of moving to cleaner forms of energy.
You didn't mention running out, David, and I told you this 3 years ago. It's peaking, not running out.
I disagree. I do not think that the world is going to run out of fossil fuels.
You didn't say run out. You're peaking. That's what he said to you too. Listen.
Do you mean then run out of affordable fossil fuels? Because you're now saying you're not saying we're going to run out of fossil fuels. You're going to say we'll run out of affordable fossil fuels, eh?
Okay, I'm gonna. Yeah.
The point here is long before you run out of fossil fuels, or before oil is so unavailable that there's not enough to use, you've run into environmental constraints for climate change. And so you should be moving forward to new technologies to substitute for oil for environmental reasons, not peak oil reasons, in my opinion. I know you disagree, but I have that view. Let's assume that we did run out of oil. You know, we actually used to export things in sailing ships. I think and I'm not saying we're going to go back to that, but I'm not one of those people who plans environmental choices because of peak oil.
Great. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And look, politicians might be many things, but very few of us are futurists. And what you're asking us to do is look at what the world might look and act and feel like at the end of the 21st century. I think we will stop using fossil fuels before we run out of them. And we are already, I think we are much closer to a technological tipping point in stationary energy and transport than we give ourselves credit for. And we will continue to need transport infrastructure and transport tools that do not run on fossil fuels. Now, whether that's in 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, I don't know. But I also think we're going to continue to accelerate our trade with each other across the globe. And what that might be and how we produce that food. No, this is very important, because we're hearing about a laboratory in California that is now able to make milk and milk fats in a laboratory rather than out of a cow. Now, I don't think the shareholders in Fonterra should be rushing to trade in their shares or sell their farms, but I think it's an example of the fact that we simply don't know what the future's going to look like. And it's going to be very, very different from food production, from water quality, from transport infrastructure, and a million other things.
Righto. Young lady. Oh, Eugenie.
Well, to be here in 100 years' time, we need to do something about climate change, because that is our most serious environmental, social and economic issue. And that's why we would put a real price on carbon and recycle the revenue that would generate back to businesses through a 1% tax cut, and to households by making the first $2,000 of income tax-free. Because climate change, we have to act. National says because our emissions are relatively small globally, we can dismiss that. But we need to be part of the solution, not part of the problem, and that's why Climate Protection Plan is one of the Greens' 4 top priorities this election.
Thanks, Eugenie. I think really the key thing that draws us all together, though, is we're talking about environmental limits, and that's...
What would each of your parties do to improve water quality by working with farmers to encourage and promote more sustainable farming methods, including organic farming, to reduce and eliminate the use of soluble nitrogen fertilisers, acid-based fertilisers, to improve soil biology and soil water holding capacity? Have you got any answers on that?
Great question. Geoff mentioned, I think he was referring to some work by people like Alison Jews, who is a former veterinarian and has done a lot of consultancy work with farmers about how you reduce the input costs but actually increase your cash flow. And that's through going for a more pastoral system rather than all the palm kernel imports. And so I think that is really where the future is, rather than intensifying, actually looking at the input costs and looking at what you're generating. And yes, there are a lot of farmers who are actually doing good practice, but as the Parliamentary Commissioner has highlighted, it's the scale of land use change that will lead to more water pollution. So that's why we need to have a stronger regulatory framework as well.
Yeah, I think the most important thing is the regulatory framework. I think OECD studies show that from around the world, and actually New Zealand's experience proves it as well. You do need rules to control inappropriate behaviour. I also think New Zealand's got a wonderful history of investment in science relating to agriculture, and we've got more scientific capability than that and than most countries in the world, and particularly in respect of ruminants and grazing systems. And there's no doubt that more needs to be done in that area, including in respect of lower impact systems. The final thing I'll say is I used to be tied up with a company called A2 Corporation, which was founded in Dunedin. I was involved in it. I remember meeting the then chief executive of the New Zealand Dairy Board pre-Fonterra, was a man called Warren Larson, and I can remember him then lamenting the fact that New Zealand had fallen off the wagon when it came to natural nitrogen fixes. And he thought that we had mucked up the nitrogen cycle by becoming too reliant on artificial substitutes for natural nitrogen fixes. And I've always remembered that. And I suspect we're going to have to rediscover that as part of the solution.
You like clover.
Yeah.
Not for the first time, and it won't be for the last time. I agree with nearly everything my colleague David has said, and Eugenie for that matter. Yes, it's about good rules, and I'm very proud of the improvements in the environmental standards and rules that we, over the past 6 years, that we've introduced, but also it's about good science. Through the very, very tough period of the last 6 years, only 3 vote areas had an increase in real terms. It was health, education, and science and innovation. And much of that science and innovation investment has gone into agricultural science for that very reason. Well, it is true of health. If you want to have a health debate, David, I will take you to a health debate and we'll have that debate. Because that's my home territory, that's my home ground advantage, and I will debate you any day on health. But today it's about environmental water quality and environmental science, so you'll probably win on your home ground, but I'll take you on health any day.
Hello, my name's Chris Arbuckle. My question's for all the party members. The MPS addressed some of the issues around iwi involvement in decision making with water management, and there's still a major elephant in the room regarding iwi rights in water. So I'm wondering what each party member or the policies that are currently sitting behind the scene on that. Thanks.
Well, to the last issue first, so we've made it very clear that nobody owns water, whether that's foreshore and seabed or rivers and lakes, not even the Crown actually, as it turns out. In respect of iwi involvement, I don't have a great knowledge. What I will say is that there have been 43 settlements under the Treaty of Waitangi since we came to office, and I think the Honourable Chris Finlayson will be well and fondly regarded by iwi for his efforts in leading that negotiation process, because water has been a very, very important part of that. And I'd also add that the Whanganui River and the Waikato River Accords are very, very good examples of where iwi and runanga can have partnership, say, in the management and environmental improvements in those very iconic waterways.
The Land and Water Forum did some good work in this issue, and I'm going to quote from their report. They stated, iwi rights and interests also need to be resolved. We see significant win-wins in this process, including the development of underutilised land and resources and the ability of iwi to partner with others in the growing of the water economy, including through the development of infrastructure. And then they have a series of recommendations. That was a good thing to reach some agreement upon, including across all of the interests, be they agricultural, environmental NGOs or other bodies, be they business or environmental. Our policy on this is pretty general. It says that we agree with these statements that are in the Land and Water Forum report, and that the issue of such rights and interests in fresh water will need to be resolved as between iwi, hapu and the Crown, and that we'll endeavour to do so. Can I address the second point you made, is why don't you confer a property right before you charge for it? I think there are a couple of answers to that. One is this difficulty as to whether anyone should own water, and the second is the experience in New Zealand in respect of fishing quota is on one hand good, but on the other hand bad. The good thing is that we've actually got a better fisheries management regime than some other countries. One of the bad things is that it's actually quite hard to change the environmental baselines, and I know you've written on this, because you come up against considerable commercial pressure. The other bad thing in respect of, in my opinion, in respect of what we did with fisheries, which is overall a very good story, and I don't mean to criticise it, but if we were doing it again, I think we would do it with resource rentals there rather than creating a capital good that is tradable, for partly reasons of social mobility. You know, we actually don't have many small fishing people able to go out there and fish these days, because we've created capital barriers through bidding up the price of a capital value in that good. We also have intergenerational inequities caused by the way we did that, because it's a public good, and yet the benefit of that was actually effectively transferred to one generation
whereas a resource rental actually achieves intergenerational fairness.
More discussion between iwi, hapu and the Crown. I'm not going to make any suggestions now as to where that will end up, but there's a lot of discussion and negotiation in that space. I guess one concern though is with things like the Waikato River Valley Authority, we are potentially getting a whole range of different managers of water across the country without sort of consistent models. And when the exclusive economic zone legislation was going through Parliament, there were a number of submissions there from iwi about how it should be improved to take greater account of iwi values, to make sure cultural impact assessments were done, and similarly with the RMA, to make sure that those concerns are a fundamental part of decisions. So the RMA can certainly be improved there, but there's a lot of water to go under, a lot of bridges in terms of that overall discussion about iwi and the Crown.